So I'm going to kick off. I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Professor Kate Dommett at the University of Sheffield, where I'm a Professor of Digital Politics. I'd really like to welcome you all along today and to start by thanking our fantastic lineup of speakers, who I'm really looking forward to hearing to. So I just wanted to say a few words about the group that has organised this session. So we are the Technology, Internet and Politics Group, which is a group within the Political Studies Association in the UK. And effectively, we set this group up because there are so many fascinating debates going on at the moment around technology and the way that it is affecting our society. And there's some really difficult problems that we need to resolve. And we've felt that there was a real opportunity to try and facilitate more conversations between academics working in this space and policymakers and those within civil society who were trying to make policy and to really tackle these ideas in the real world. So we've been operating for just over a year. If you're not a member already, which I know many of you are, then please do get involved. We've got a membership of over 300 people and we're regularly putting on events. So coming up in early November, we're going to be doing an event on data access for researchers in collaboration with the British Academy. So look out for details of that. And we're also kind of involved in more standard academic conferences as well. So please do get involved. You can sign up on our website or drop any of us an email. And we have a regular newsletter if you've ever got any opportunities that you want to publicise. But I will say nothing further and get in the way of the panelists. I just want to take this moment to really thank Julia Sandru, who I'm about to hand over to for all the work that she's done in putting this event together. So Julia, over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for the introduction. So welcome, everyone. We are going to discuss together about EI regulation, fairness, inclusiveness, and innovation, and the challenges around that, together with a series of distinguished speakers. First of all, Helena Quinn, who's Principal Policy Advisor for EI and Data Science at the Information Commission Officer, which is the UK data protection regulator. She's worked at the intersection of policy and EI, both in academia and industry. And she also an expert on algorithm audits and the role they can play in the regulation of EI through the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, for example. We also welcome Jack Stilgo, who's a professor of science and technology studies at the University College London, where he works mostly on the governance of emerging technologies, and he's principal investigator in several projects, but in particular is a fellow of the Turing Institute and is part of the UK RI Responsible EI Leadership Team. We also welcome Giovanni De Gregorio, who's chair in law and technology at Cattolica Global School of Law and Cattolica Lisbon School of Law. And he published last year a very well-read, very excellent monograph, a book on digital constitutionalism. And he published also on several other outlets, research outlets. We also welcome Kai Zenner, who's the head of office and digital policy advisor for the MEP Axel Voss in the European Parliament. And he's an expert on digital policies and regulation at EU level, but also comparatively speaking. And he's working extensively, in particular, on the EI Act at the moment. And he holds diplomas both in law and political science. And the discussant, the chair, will actually be organizing a bit the discussion in this roundtable is Giulia Gentile, who's lecturer in law at Essex Law School, and her research focuses on the promotion of human rights in digital society in the EU and in constitutional law. She's particularly interested in the use of EI in legal profession and justice system in general. So if that's okay for you, we can start maybe with the first panelist, meaning Giovanni, and then we'll move to the next one in about 10-15 minutes. So the floor is yours. Thank you. And please try to stay within the 15 minutes limit for your comments. We'll have time at the end to discuss all together. Thank you so much. Yep. And looking forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. I would just ask you if it is possible to share the slide, if I can be, because I see that I can't, since I'm not an host, just to share with you a couple of slides. But I promise that I will stay even less than, I will speak for less than 15 minutes, including this time that I'm losing right now.
Should be okay now. You should be able
to. Okay, no, I'm trying to fix that. Okay, now it should be fine. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, here we are. I hope you can see the screen as usual. And thank you so much again. It's such a pleasure to see you all here and have this chance to think about this big, huge question that are increasingly discussed about what should we do with AI in terms of governance, in terms of regulation. And I mean, the perspective that I'm bringing today, I could definitely, I don't want to talk about usually, for instance, I mean, at least from my perspective, what the EU is doing with the AI Act is definitely important, but still, and I'm sure that other people will talk about that. In order to start, I would like also maybe to have an exercise with you to frame the problem that we are addressing when we talk about the governance of AI. We talk about governing AI. What we're going to do in this presentation, I'm just trying to see what are the questions and why we talk about the governance of AI up to a certain point, at least from my perspective, if you want. And also why the risk regulation has become quite the standard when we talk about AI and AI governance and AI regulation. So why we talk about increasingly normativity and risk regulation when we address the questions of AI. So basically what I'm going to do is actually to give you first of all, we'll have a short conversation about, if you want, when we can define what are the different layers of governance, when we can define the normativity of AI, where do we see this problem, and also how risk regulation is there as come as a solution, if you want, to deal with such a complexity, which, as we'll see, with some problems that comes from the normativity of different systems. So, but having said that, usually, I would like to start looking at this slide, thinking about the idea of, we usually talk about 3 layers of governance. Even when we think about the governance of AI, we usually think about, we have the state governance because we know that there is law, there is public enforcement, there is the possibility to address AI, regulating AI with the AI Act, will enforce these rules, and so forth. So we usually have the level of state governance, the possibility of the state to do something with AI, and that's fair. And we know what are the challenges and we know what are the problems. But still, we have another problem with AI when we tend to address AI governance as a form of platform governance. So we always look at platforms and we think about that these actors are so powerful because they're able to enforce their terms of services, their standards, so through private enforcement. And we usually look at how AI is a tool to exercise platform governance, a state governance, if you want, when the government, for instance, uses AI for public purposes, for instance. So we usually play with these both ideas of governance: is state, is private, is public, is the state, are platforms, and we play with the role of who should be accountable for what AI does. But when we speak of AI governance, there is even, at least in my opinion, there is even a third layer about what AI is doing in terms with its own codes and standards. Because usually we tend to look at about the AI as a form of think of neutral thing, even if this is biased. But we think like AI more as a tool, to enforce things that are defined by the public or by the private, whatever, and interpret, any kind of these kind of rules, But actually, my provocation here, also to open a little bit, also the conversation here, is about that sometimes we tend to forget that AI, some types of AI, particularly the ones that changes across time by experience, like machine learning and non-deterministic systems, generally speaking, unsupervised systems, they also change their own rules, change the ways how they not only enforce and interpret, but also how they decide from day 1 to day 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is because this actually decision-making changes across time, changes across experience. And so what happens when we have a system, that is even used by public actors or private actors, and public actors and private actors like state, platform, give rules to these systems, but at the end, this system shapes its own rules across the time. So what I'm saying is that basically we have another governance layer that is not just about what should we do with AI when it's implemented by the public or the private. We also have a layer that it's of the AI itself. What should we do when AI learn by experience and change the way in which it makes decisions, And so this is the shaping of the decision making of AI raised really the point of what should we do. But you know what is the problem? Is that since AI, especially, most of the systems are probabilistic, of course, we are not sure what this actually will be the output. And so this is actually what welcomes, in a certain sense, what actually pushes us to embrace the idea of risk regulation, especially when you look from the state perspective, from the governance, from the state governance perspective, because we do not know what to do, because the AI is unpredictable. It changes choice after 2 days because it's trained on different data that you have no even idea, you are not even aware of. So the only thing you can do actually is just adopt the form of risk regulation, because at the end, we're talking about probability. So at the end, we're talking about risks. And so actually, this is actually why we are increasingly seeing risk as a proxy for regulation. When we think about how we can govern these different layers of normativity across the state, the platforms, I mean the big techs, just to simplify, or generally speaking, the private sector that is actually driving the questions around AI. But also we see as a risk is becoming a combination, of course, of probability for managing the consequence, if you want, that we get. It's the same problem that we are not sure what AI is doing, so we need to use a risk-based approach in order to address this issue. And this also is going inside regulation, of course. So risk analysis is increasingly relevant in regulation, especially when we think about different pieces of legislation. And we can make just a very simple example, not only because we are increasingly speaking about a risk society for many reasons, even outside the digital realm, but also because even when we look at AI, we are increasingly exposed to this idea of risk regulation. And I mean, probably you have already an idea about how it works. I'm not here to explain what the AI Act says about that. But generally speaking, even the AI Act talks the language, if you want to use the language of risk, exactly to address the problem raised by AI. And the problem is that this risk, one of the issues is that this risk is defined by the top. And so it's not sure actually what it means sometimes. And these also have been challenges that have been addressed even at the political level. But the problem is still, it is that it's not only the AI Act raising question for the risk-based regulation, or it's just the AI Act expressing this risk-based regulation, because even when we move to a broader framework, just to simplify, even when we look, for example, at other examples in Europe, like the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, we are still increasingly seeing a reliance on the idea of the risk-based regulation. And all these pieces of regulation, even if everyone is focused now on the AI Act in Europe, even the Digital Services Act, even for the GDPR, for obvious reasons, will very much concern the governance of AI. But the risk-based approach that we are following are very different. But still, the important thing to stress is that the risk-based approach is spreading across these different layers of normativity, spreading across state governance, platform governance, and even AI governance. So risk is becoming really the core of the system, not only of the regulation, but also the core of the system. Is the only way in which, in a way, state governance is trying to, as we'll see at the end, to give a sense to the rule of law in the digital age, to give a sense what should be the rule governing AI. No one knows, so we are using a risk-based approach. So if something bad happens, then you should find who is accountable. So this actually is another important point to address when we think about the AI governance, precisely because it's not just about governing with old ways, the problem, the questions raised by the state. You use public law, use delegation, use constitutional law, or private actors, so you use contract law, consumer law, competition law, whatever. You have also another layer of normativity, another layer of governance that requires a different approaches by public and private actors in order to govern these issues. And this is also why, in a certain sense, going back on just one slide, the AI Act is actually, if you want, a reaction to this issue. It's also a reaction not only because it's important to have a new regulatory framework for AI, it's also important to have something that it's actually introduce a regulatory system that can fit with the type and the peculiarities of AI. Not only, of course, there are a lot of challenges in the AI Act, but this is just the tip of the iceberg. So the problem is actually to understand how to limit the governance of AI and what we can delegate to AI, considering this issue. And this is actually, of course, lead us, of course, especially in Europe, towards this balancing. On the one hand, we know that all the digital technologies, but technology themselves have risks, have problems, have issues. And on the other hand, we want to promote innovation. So the point is that not only to find a balance between the two things, but also to ensure how we can foster, of course, innovation and responsibility, even in the field of AI, ensuring this balance. And this, of course, leads us again to risk-based regulation. And you know why? Because exactly risk-based regulation allows us to not, of course, to adopt like a rights-based approach where actually everything is actually comes from the top, it's clear, and there is no space for innovation on the same point. But on the other hand, the risk of this approach, of a risk-based approach, is a risk for the rule of law, because you have not a clear idea about what's going on when we address AI. And always it's about a case-by-case assessment, about responsibility, about accountability, because you need to assess the risk. You need to assess that on a case-by-case assessment. So and this is a big shift for in the governance of AI. We are not governing AI looking at right-based approach, a traditional way in which the law functions, if A, then B, but we are using a different ways, a more like, if you want, even probabilistic way for the law, that if A, then it could be B, C, D, F, G. So, and this is change of approach, this new balancing between innovation and risk is really opening the door towards a new discussion when we speak about AI governance. So just to conclude, because I promised that I mean, definitely. So what actually if you want the takeaways for you, or even for me, to be fair, are that we are not facing just a single governance or normativity framework when we talk about AI. So it's not just about what the state can do. It's not just about what big tech can do. It's also about what actually AI can do. And it's also important to understand that the normative power of AI is going beyond being just a tool of enforcement of interpretation, but it's going a little bit farther than that, to be fair. And also what we are seeing and experiencing is that in order to deal with such a complexity and such an issue among these three layers of governance, risk-based regulation is really coming is in a way to help, in a certain sense, the state governance framework to reposition, if you want, to position the rule of law in the algorithmic society, if you want. So in a certain sense, the risk-based regulation is a compromise in order to deal with these three layers of governance. But these are just my views. If you're more interested in this topic, feel free, of course, to look at these works that I work even with some of my colleagues about the normative power of AI, the idea of the risk-based approach. If you're super interested, this is also part of my research on digital constitutionalism. But again, I promise that I speak for less than 15 minutes. So thank you so much, and happy to be here with all of you. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think now we can give the floor to Helena. Thank you.
Okay, let me just get the PowerPoint up. So, can everybody see this? Great. Okay, so cool. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about the UK's approach to AI regulation, as well as the role of algorithm audits in regulation. So one thing I was asked to actually address was the competing pressures of regulation and innovation in AI policy. So I think I'll talk about that one first. So I think this view of innovation and regulation being sort of at odds with each other or in competition is a false one. I think clear regulation actually stimulates innovation because people know what the rules are, and it really brings down the costs of innovation. And of course, regulation has to be designed well, which is why there's a lot of engagement with the public and with private and third sectors before anything's developed. It then also needs to be really clear to everyone what the rules are. And I'll talk more about regulatory clarity a bit later. But now I'm going to go on to the UK proposals for AI regulation. So as in other countries, the UK has really seen an explosion in the applications of AI. And with ChatGPT last year, we've seen a huge increase in public awareness of the use of AI. So with all these applications in things ranging from minor chatbots to medical diagnostics, there's a huge amount of innovation going on. But also there's increasing awareness of the novel risks that AI brings about. And that includes things like children using a chatbot being exposed to harmful generated content, or a medical diagnostics tool giving biased results of people of certain ethnicities. And there are lots of concerns that we hear repeatedly about things like safety and security, fairness and bias, transparency and explainability, and accountability and redress. So to tackle these issues, the UK is taking a domain-specific approach to AI regulation, which we, the ICO, think is a sound one, because we think context is everything in AI. So an AI-backed chat function helping customers at a cinema raises different questions compared to one for a healthcare center. So even if the underlying technology is the same. So businesses need to take accountability for identifying and mitigating the risks that occur from developing and deploying AI in their context. So a few months ago, the UK government published a white paper that set out its policy proposals for regulating AI that put current regulators at their center. So at the core of the paper were 5 principles. That's safety, security, and robustness, appropriate transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress. The idea is that regulators use their domain-specific expertise to tailor the implementation of the principles to the specific context in which AI is used. And these principles are going to be initially on a non-statutory footing, with the idea being that the regulatory ecosystem and government learn how the implementation is functioning and adapt either the principles or the powers and approaches regulators take, and then eventually put the principles on a statutory footing. And there are lots of other structures wrapped around the implementation of these principles, like a central coordinating function within government to work with the regulators, but that's still being scoped. So I'm going to focus more on the principles. So at the ICO, we're very well prepared to implement them, because these principles map almost one-to-one onto data protection principles, and they're issues that we've been working on for years. So we also have lots of experience in giving organizations clarity on the law, including these principles, through our guidance on AI and data protection. And we've provided practical tools like our award-winning AI and data protection risk toolkit. And we've offered support through our innovation advice service and regulatory sandbox. And we think that greater regulatory clarity is an important enabler of innovation, and we don't see innovation and regulation as a genuine trade-off. So if people know the rules, they innovate to meet those rules. For example, we're seeing lots of solutions being created to meet the requirements of auditing in different jurisdictions. And I'll talk more about auditing in a minute. So as different applications have emerged, we've continued to provide more clarity. For example, earlier this year, we published a blog setting out the priorities that organizations developing or deploying generative AI need to address. And the important thing for us now is that this regulatory clarity actually translates into regulatory compliance. So we work with regulators domestically and internationally. For example, with our investigation into Clearview AI, we collected images of people in the UK from the web and social media to train and develop its facial recognition tech that it sold to the police. And so we did a joint investigation with the Australian Data Protection Authority, and then we both took enforcement action, as are others. And then domestically, we are a member of the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which brings us together with the Office for Communications, the Competition and Markets Authority, and the Financial Conduct Authority to develop joint approaches to issues about AI and digital regulation. And one of those issues is algorithm audits. So I will now move on to talking about those kind of audits. So algorithm audits can take lots of different forms, and they have various purposes. So companies developing and deploying algorithmic systems will probably usually want to demonstrate that the systems work as they claim they do and don't result in or facilitate harms, whether they're intended or unintended. So developers can use an audit as feedback to support continuous monitoring and improvement. And managers can use audit to assess the impact of a system and its suitability for the purpose that they aim to achieve. And regulators want to verify legal compliance, and end users might want to know details behind the decisions made about them and the effects on their decision making. So some other parties that aren't directly affected by the system, like academics or journalists, might also have an interest in scrutinizing the system for public interest or research purposes. So the members of this DRCF are well, all of us are having to look into whether algorithmic systems lead to unlawful outcomes. And that could be through investigations or enforcement, or ex ante things like the use of pre-launch testing environments like sandboxes. And that means that we as regulators need to understand how to reliably and consistently assess the impact of these systems. But we're not just concerned about the system itself. It also matters what the broader context about the broader context is that the system is used in. So an organization could use an algorithmic system as part of a decision-making process that directly affects the circumstances of an individual or society. And it could determine whether someone gets a mortgage, or a facial recognition technology that could screen customers in a supermarket to assess whether a customer is old enough to buy alcohol. The system will be part of a wider decision architecture. So that could involve human review before a final decision is made. And we as regulators are really concerned about the whole decision-making process. So, for example, whether that consumer has been treated in a fair and non-discriminatory way, if they've been provided with transparency information that they can understand, and whether appropriate safeguards are in place to protect their privacy. So we don't just care about how a specific algorithm works and how a system produces its decision, but how that system fits within the overall decision-making process and the wider checks and balances that organizations provide and the role of human oversight. So the type of audit that regulators might be interested in, that might vary depending on the remit and regulatory approach. So a sectoral regulator, such as the Financial Conduct Authority, that's one of our partners, might focus primarily on making sure that the appropriate governance and accountability mechanisms surrounding the outcomes of an algorithmic processing system in financial services are clear. But for example, we as the ICO might focus on both the process by which personal data is processed using algorithmic systems, but also the outcome of that processing. So where we do investigations and enforcement activity, inspection of a system might form part of the investigatory process. So there are broadly three types of audits, and this is based on a paper that the DRCF produced last year. So we worked for a long time we worked with industry and with civil society to come up with this taxonomy of what was actually being done in practice. So there's governance audits, which broadly look at whether an organization deploying an algorithmic system has the appropriate policies governing its use and has followed good practice in the procedures and documentation surrounding that system's design and implementation. An empirical audit is designed to make sure the effects of using an algorithmic system by assessing the system inputs and outputs. And a technical audit allows for a look under the hood to find out if there might be an issue in a system. And that technical audit allows you to explore a system's inner workings to see if there are problems with the data, the source code, or the methods used. And in some cases, regulators have used all three of these approaches in one investigation. There are a number of different actors who might carry out audits. So as we've seen, regulators can use their legal powers to inspect algorithms in certain cases. So at the ICO, our powers mean we can conduct consensual audits or compulsory audits by issuing assessment notices. And we see auditing really as a constructive process that really benefits the organizations that we work with. And we want to really have a participative engagement with them. And we also run our regulatory sandbox, which has helped companies like Onfido, which is a facial recognition company, to measure and mitigate the algorithmic bias in a data protection compliant way in their tech. But there are also others. So I mentioned earlier the growing number of private and third sector bodies that are also interested in auditing algorithms. And that can be tech companies that produce either in-house or off-the-shelf audit tools for other companies to procure. There are smaller companies popping up now that offer things like bias audits. You've got academics that do their own research into tools, they tend to do, if they don't have access to the system, they tend to do more of empirical audits to look at the inputs and outputs, as do investigative journalists and advocacy groups. And in some cases, like particularly where results are made public, the audits carried out by those other bodies can really provide a degree of assurance that systems are trustworthy, and they can uncover potential harmful outcomes from the use of algorithms. So ultimately, audits are trying to address asymmetries of information, because in most cases, you need specialized knowledge to understand complex algorithmic systems. And those asymmetries can happen at every level. So it could be between developers and users of a system. The organization developing a system will know much more about it than consumers or people who are affected by the outputs of the system, and regulators who are responsible for ensuring the use of the system is compliant with the law. So audit is looking to solve that kind of information asymmetry by making sure the system is reviewed by someone with suitable specialist knowledge who can convey information about the impact of the system to other people. Audit isn't necessarily the only way to do that, though. You can close the information gap through explicit mandatory transparency requirements or using a pre-authorization system review to highly specified standards to make sure that only systems with certain characteristics can enter a market. But overall, we think that audit is a really important tool that can support transparency and accountability. And those two are key to AI regulation, particularly in data protection. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Now I will give the floor to Jack Stilgo if he's now ready for his comments, and then we'll finish with Kai Zenner, comments, and then the chair will also present some concluding comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Hi all. I don't have any slides, but I have some. I have thoughts, and I might just riff on some of the brilliant provocations that Giovanni and Helena have already provided, because I think it really helps put some of this in context. And it's great to see for an academic like me the sort of regulatory and analytical movement happening around AI. But as a social scientist looking at this, I'm a professor of science and technology policy with interests in emerging technologies, responsible innovation, that sort of thing. I still worry that we need to get real about power. We still need to think really hard about who is getting to shape the debate. And we need to think about whether the regulatory response is not just asking the right questions, but asking them at the right sort of scale and asking them at the right sort of volume. If I've got a moment later, I might talk a bit about the example of, I've just finished a project looking at the governance of self-driving vehicles, which is my sort of case study of artificial intelligence in the wild, where I was particularly interested in questions of how a technology that uses a substantial amount of machine learning can be complemented with what some social scientists would call social learning, right? The ability of societies to understand, make sense of, and make decisions about emerging technologies in real time. That project is now finished. I'm now part of a thing. I've just put it in the chat, and Julia mentioned it before. A new program that launched in the summer called the Responsible AI Program, which is a UKRI initiative to fund interdisciplinary research that seeks to address exactly the sorts of questions that are of interest to us here this afternoon. Like I think a lot of us, we've been slightly taken by surprise by the last year of public debate, public awareness about some of these issues. When the proposal went in, it was still a fairly sort of niche issue. And then by the time we launched in the summer, it turned out that everyone everywhere was talking about artificial intelligence, which is good, but also we need to ask, well, how are they talking about artificial intelligence? And does that way of talking, does the debate reflect a rather narrow set of interests at the moment? So those of you in the UK will know that in about a month's time, there is a planned AI summit led by our Prime Minister. And, that would seem to be a sort of valuable initiative in diplomacy and at least raising the volume for the regulatory discussion. But the concern is that the framing of that summit is a very peculiar one. So the sorts of risks that have been identified are quite odd. The framing of the summit in terms of quotes AI safety is quite odd in the absence of the sorts of risk assessment, risk analysis that Giovanni was pointing us towards. And I wonder whether a small clique of people is currently controlling and framing the discussion in ways that are extremely convenient to an emerging AI industry, whose interests are not really being challenged. And my fear, while I recognize the value of the sort of work that the ICO are doing in trying to make us aware of the risks and mitigate those risks, is that the UK government has gone down an approach that says, basically wait and see when it comes to AI risk, and that risks generating some very nasty surprises indeed. I mean, my experience is in regulatory debates around the 1990s, 2000s, in terms of environmental health risks, where we had approaches based in the precautionary principle that are now oddly invisible when it comes to the debate about artificial intelligence, a debate where the uncertainties are certainly as profound, if not far more profound, than, say, the uncertainties around medicines or agricultural biotechnology. And yet there's a lot of faith invested in this risk-based approach, this sort of wait and see type approach. And I worry also that doesn't just validate a system of organized irresponsibility on the part of the developers of AI, but maybe it's also central government washing its hands and in effect asking domain-specific regulators to take on the responsibility that they often do not have the resources to do so. Meanwhile, central government is talking about risk in these very grand terms, in terms that are that come straight out of Silicon Valley, where in effect the risk of AI is imagined to be a sort of existential one that comes from an out of control technology. And again, that's something that we've seen, those of us that have been around these debates for a while. I remember back in 2000, the tech leader, the Elon Musk of his time, Bill Joy, wrote a piece called "Why the Future Doesn't Need Us," where he explained that nanotechnology was going to create these existential risks that were going to kill us all. And the trouble is that he couldn't imagine any way of regulating out of that situation. And so it became this sort of fever dream. Kate Crawford and Alex Campolo have a nice phrase. They call this sort of mode of thinking about technology one of enchanted determinism, where the technology is imagined to be both inevitable and magical. And therefore, we stop paying attention to the people that are actually creating the technology, how they're creating it, and why they might want to do it. So if I might end with a plea, it's to think about regulation and public trust, not just in terms of what artificial intelligence does or might do, but also about how artificial intelligence works. So Helena mentioned questions of process, transparency, accountability, interpretability, all of those sorts of things, which have been downplayed because of the black box nature of the technology. They're very inconvenient for the developers of the technology to engage with. And questions of purpose, the sorts of things that members of the public will care about. They will care about, why is this technology being developed? Who is likely to benefit from it? What problems is it going to solve? What problems is it going to create? And if we don't engage with questions of technological purposes and technological trajectories, we might see the sorts of backlash that, in Europe at least, led to the withering of the biotechnology industry in the 2000s. So I think that there's a lot that's currently being left out of the debate. And it's not being left out for reasons of ignorance or naivety. It's being left out because it's convenient to the people that are developing the technology. These things will get realized as artificial intelligence systems carry on developing and moving into our lives. I would like a situation where we can get a bit better at doing the sort of anticipatory technology assessment. That means we can think about what AI might do and where it might go before we are locked into various systems whose risks eventually prove problematic. That's the system that we've got into with social media, and we don't want that situation to be repeated again here. I won't go into the self-driving vehicles stuff as a case study, but if anybody wants to ask about it, I'd be obviously happy to go on about it, but hopefully that's a useful provocation for now.
Thank you. As political scientists here, those that are in the organizing committee, we are all for asking questions about power. So thank you for raising the issue. That's perfectly aligning with our research and interests. So now I'll give the floor to Kai Zenner from the European Parliament to give some of his comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. And yeah, it was really interesting to hear from my co-panelists their views and their assessments. I would, because I'm from the AI negotiations on the AI Act, I will give you a little bit of insights where we are standing right now in Brussels, why we are currently all extremely tired and really looking forward to the end of the year, because actually on the 6th of December is at the moment the most realistic date for concluding the AI Act, as at least on political level. So then there is a so-called handshake deal afterwards. We still need to fine-tune potentially a little bit. The lawyer linguists need to go over the text, the legal service, translation, and so on and so on. So even if we manage on the 6th of December the political deal, the AI Act will not enter into force before, let's say, May or June next year. And even then there are transition periods and so on. So until everything is really applicable, it will take still a lot of time. There's also currently a bit of discussion if there should be different transition periods. So certain parts of the AI Act would apply already after 6 months, maybe others after 2 years, others after 4 years, and so on. This is maybe already an indication about what I wanted to talk also in my 3 blocks a little bit about it. It shows that the legislator is really a bit unsure how to regulate artificial intelligence, even after all those years that we are now discussing it on European level. As you know, it started in the, let's say, 2015-16 with first initiative reports. Then the parliament had so-called own initiative reports where we actually presented some draft legislation. The Commission had the white paper and then the AI Act. And all of those proposals, again, had a similar concern. How do we catch a technology that is so fast developing? And I think this I wanted to underline because several of my co-panelists were making similar points, that, yeah, it's really tricky. And the Commission has chosen a product safety legislation approach, which for conservative liberal parties in the European Parliament was in general a good idea, is a good idea, because it's something that is very much established in the European Union. There are clear rules, clear jurisprudence or judgments from the European Court, but also from national competent authorities and so on. And many people were saying back then, yes, it makes sense, and it will potentially lead to a situation that our European companies feel that there's a kind of legal certainty enabling them to do proper investments in AI. And on top, it was also mentioned, we have the risk-based approach, which many people are also underlining as extremely positive. Again, also from my political group and I myself do think that a risk-based approach is in general a good idea, because it makes sense in general terms to really focus only on the most risky systems, and maybe for everything else have no additional rules or only reduced obligations. And then another, let's say, positive aspect from all of our prep work was that the AI Act, so the proposal from the European Union for a legislative act to regulate artificial intelligence, was heavily based on international concepts, things that have been discussed also for many years on international fora like OECD, like UNESCO, like Council of Europe, ISO, international standardization bodies, and so on and so on. Again, all of that together, first we had a rather good feeling, at least with this conceptual background. But then after some time, and I said this already at the beginning, it showed that it's all not so easy, and it's all not really fitting and able to, let's say, catch up with the fast developments in the sector of artificial intelligence. And what we also saw that the AI Act as a horizontal piece of legislation is trying to be, again, a kind of silver bullet, which is then applicable for every AI system, for every sector in which AI systems are being developed and deployed. And this, again, leads to a lot of problems, because there are certain responsibilities that make sense for certain developers that develop an AI system for a specific sector, but do not make sense or are also technically not feasible to fulfill in other sectors. And what we then, as co-legislators, so the member state and the parliamentarians, did was with a lot of time identifying, first of all those legislative overlaps with existing and other upcoming legislation, for example, making sure that provider of an AI system do not need to fulfill a risk assessment based on the AI Act, and in parallel, an almost similar or almost identical risk assessment based on sectorial legislation, for example, from the health sector, that they do not need to provide technical documentation because of the AI Act and another legislation. We also tried to clarify what happens in a situation where two laws are colliding, when, for example, one law is saying you're allowed to use the technology in that way, and the AI Act was to the bans. There were a lot of commercially fully normal and legal practices that would have fallen under the prohibitions of the AI Act. And also there we needed to make sure that as a legislator is not in the end creating certain outcomes that we really didn't want. But the biggest problem was really that, again, this idea of putting AI as something that is so dynamic and so much open also to change, to learn, for example, due to new input data, new or at least adjust a little bit the capabilities in this fixed legal concepts of, again, product safety, of certain risk classes, and so on and so on. Because after being confronted with more and more use cases, and especially with newer use cases coming from the area of ChatGPT, foundation models, and so on, we needed to acknowledge after some time more and more that while risk-based approach might sound good, it's not really always useful because, again, an AI system, especially if it's not yet a system, but a foundation model or something with a lot of different intended purposes, like a general purpose AI system like ChatGPT, it's not really possible to just put it in one risk category because, again, there are potentially dozens of different intended purposes. Those things, again, some of them we solved. We hope we are managing to solve all of them until the end of the year. I wanted to, in the second block, quickly underline a little bit 4 major challenges that are still at the moment heavily being discussed, and so far where we do not really have a clear answer. And I talked so long about those conceptual problems in order for you to better understand them. I talked already about the bans. So the AI Act in Article 5 is creating a list of prohibitions. And as I said, it's for example, I would say self-explaining that we in Europe and also many third countries outside the European Union do not want social scoring like it was presented that China will implement it, and well, they tested it at least. But social scoring, as it was defined, similar to the example that I gave already, does also include certain commercial practices that are completely common. So we really needed to further specify what we mean. We needed to add a lot of exemptions, but especially when it's then coming to law enforcement, we have, of course, the typical problem that every political scientist knows: security versus liberties. We have there, again, at the moment on the negotiating table, the issue that the law enforcement authorities want a lot of exemptions when, for example, it comes to the use of emotional recognition, biometrical data, and so on and so on and so on. While many people in the European Parliament see it a little bit more from the fundamental rights perspective, and are very much concerned that basically all of our extremely personal data soon will be available, and we can be detected wherever we are in our city. A similar issue is then the list of high-risk use cases and also the high-risk classification. Because again, the Commission's proposal looked at the first glance quite reasonable. They had with Annex 3 a very, very specific list of use cases where I think most of the people said yes, they do pose a higher risk. But after looking on this list for a few weeks and months, I think everyone found out well, again, there are a lot of useful practices that would fall under, and also certain very simple and not really harmful practices that would, in this rather broad categorization that you can find in Annex 3, would certainly be confronted with a lot of new challenges and new responsibilities. Also that the classification of a system as high risk or non-high risk, and also those use cases are currently heavily discussed. I was already also speaking about foundation models, ChatGPT, general purpose AI system. I was talking that the AI Act was looking rather reasonable, but then technical progress was overtaking a little bit our ideas that we had, because ChatGPT and foundation model from those who were drafting the AI Act, not really anyone had in mind. And the whole question, let's say now, besides all those concerns when it comes to elections, deepfakes, fake news, fundamental rights violations, one of the other major points that the Commission originally didn't have in mind, if we are only focusing on the high-risk AI system or prohibited AI systems and so on, we are really just looking at the downstream actors. So those actors that are really using artificial intelligence components, systems, and so on, putting them together, finalizing them, and placing them on the market or putting into servers. So using it as a commercial product or service. But those actors are heavily dependent on a lot of other actors in the AI value chain that would be not covered at all. And often it's big US corporations. They would face probably a rather useful situation that they do not need to fulfill anything in the AI Act, while those downstream actors would face a situation that they are kind of left alone and missing all the information needed to comply fully with the AI Act. And the fourth thing is governance and AI office. There's a lot of talk to learn from the mistakes from the GDPR, where at least after it became applicable in 2018, there was really a lot of legal uncertainty because of a lack of common understanding of terms, of key terms or key definitions, because different member states enforce the GDPR in a different way, because also a lack of guidelines, guidance. And there the European Parliament proposed to build up an AI office, which is, even though it's not enforcing the AI Act, but it's helping to enforce the AI Act. And it's also helping member states and the Commission to really centralize a little bit the understanding and the approaches when it comes to how to implement the AI Act. But there you can imagine that member states do not really like to give away national sovereignty. So this is another big point where currently we are a little bit unsure where we are landing, because it's rather tricky to make a decision that is making everyone happy. I told you now about those four things, and wanted to show you a little bit that due to all those conceptual problems that we have with the AI Act, there are really those 4 points where we are kind of stuck. And again, we are trying to finish on the 6th of December, but any of those 4 points could lead to a complete delay or postponement, which would mean that we would need to wait for the European election in next June, and then could only restart the negotiations on the AI Act afterwards. And this would, of course, lead to a situation that very, very likely a lot of things have happened again in the field of artificial intelligence, and a lot of things that we agreed on are potentially then outdated again. And this is one thing, again, that we are extremely concerned about, cross-party and also cross-institutions. And with that, I would also close now very soon my talk. This led us a little bit to, or pushed us into a direction where we really transformed the whole AI Act in order to make it more future-proofed in a way that we made clear that the AI Act is more, let's say, a set of general principles. It's a really principle-based legislation, meaning that of course, for example, transparency, Article 13, is important for all AI systems, especially for all high-risk AI systems. But again, not every element of this article makes sense in every sector and every system, and so on and so on. And this is then why we gave in the enforcement a little bit flexibility in order to hopefully, even if it's coming to a situation that we are not able to close the AI Act before the European election, this law does survive a little bit longer and doesn't require let's say, an update already after 6 months. And the same, and this is now really my last sentence, the same we tried also in the enforcement and governance areas that I talked about with the AI office, but also by empowering the European Commission. We gave them some capabilities and some legislative power to make quick changes, to add new use cases, to also change a little bit the criteria. Again, all under or all for the objective to really have a law that is able to be really horizontal and also future-proof and a little bit adjustable, let's say. So this would be my very short overview, and I hope,
Thank you so much. That was really very, very informative. So now I give the floor to Giulia Gentile for a bit of a wrap-up of the discussion and her comments on the other panelists' comments, and then we can open the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Giulia. And let me start by saying a big thank you to all the speakers. I have a very difficult job, I think, because I was asked to comment on the different perspectives and therefore perhaps also pick on common themes that have emerged. So what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so, because I'm also very keen to open up the discussion and listen to your reactions as well to each other's presentation, is really identifying some common threads and then perhaps raise some questions, provocations. So it seems to me that what we have discussed just now, and based on the different perspectives, there is an epistemological struggle in the sense that what we are clearly listening to based on a different presentation is that we don't know necessarily how the technology is going to evolve. We don't necessarily know what the technology will be able to do, but we know very, very well what are the harms that this technology can entail. what are the risks of this technology from, so to say, a more dynamic perspective. So inevitably here, we're dealing with a very interesting sets of questions and sets of problems, because the knowledge of the technology is still evolving, but we had already several scandals around the harms of algorithms, around also the limits of algorithms. And I can bring in very shortly my perspective. I have a research project funded by the European Commission, and I'm particularly working with judges and legal professionals. And what I can say, what I can share is that the harms and the potential also limits of the technology in the field of the legal profession and the justice systems are very much discussed by the operators in this field. And even when talking to students, law students, but also when going to conferences, what I notice is that there's a general fear about AI. And of course, some of it might be irrational, but not all of it. And I think that inevitably this puts a demand on regulators and governments to act upon this revolution. And this is where the law comes in. The law has a very strong ordering power. The law is about finding what are the different hierarchies of values and interests that through legislation. And therefore the law is a very difficult and complex set of questions that is emerging around AI. What kinds of values do we want to protect through legislation, and what kind of interest do we want to protect? And this takes me back perhaps to the different presentations. We heard about risks, we heard about power, we heard about the role of regulators through audits, and we heard as well about the comprehensive set of measures that is currently being discussed before the EU institutions that could lead to the EU AI Act, as well as the challenges around this framework. And it seems to me that when thinking about risk, for example, certainly this is a very, one can say, interesting regulatory approach, but at the same time, risk also bears some problems with itself. It's about allocating also responsibility when it comes to risks. And because of the black box problem, and also because of the evolving nature of AI, I think that when thinking about risks, we should be very mindful about the asymmetries that were also referred to in the second presentation by Helena. And I think that again, risk-based regulation also perhaps we can say free rides this asymmetry of liabilities and responsibilities, and perhaps also creates a framework that does not clearly identify what are the rights. So again, I think that there will be inevitably a loss under a risk-based approach, even though, of course, I can see the benefits of a more, one can say, dynamic and agile framework. And this brings me to the question of audits. And I was very intrigued, and myself, I've been working a lot on the UK approach to AI regulation, having participated in different submissions of evidence to the House of Lords and to the UK Parliament more in general. And when listening to audits, my main question was about the bindingness of these audits. How binding would they be in shaping the evolution of the technology? And also, what about conflicting audits? In the sense that I think that a question that perhaps should be explored by the UK regulator is whether the audit exercise should be actually a regulatory exercise, or whether perhaps there could be a risk of transforming the audit into a ticking box exercise that might not necessarily bring any concrete benefit to the public at large. And then thinking then more holistically about regulation, I was very intrigued by the comment made by Jack, whereby he said that the discussion seems to be focusing only on some elements of the AI framework of the AI governance that was also very nicely described by Giovanni. And therefore, we need to be very mindful about the drivers of this discussion and who actually shapes this discussion. So my question would be then, what should we include in this discussion? What is currently missing, and what can be done to perhaps create a more polycentric regulatory framework that does not simply oppose, we can say, regulation versus innovation, but it also takes into account the so manifold interests that emerge from the society when it comes to AI interests, and also harms that could be produced within the society. And the very final comment on the presentation by Kai, I think you very eloquently explained what are the struggles as well within the institutions to create a framework that has some form of longevity, while at the same time, of course, adapting to the technology that is rapidly shifting and changing, and inevitably, of course, we will be witnessing more on the ground in the coming months. And I think that something that really struck me based on your presentation is, in fact, the inevitable need in this field to have a public-private cooperation, in the sense that, because I would say of an original scene of regulation in this field, where there has been a very strong laissez-faire approach since the 90s. This is a field that has been regulated, but only perhaps very partially, and perhaps even in a way that has been ineffective to a certain extent, in the sense that what we see now is that governments are increasingly relying on private entities to gather knowledge about AI, to also think about AI regulation. So a provocation that I raised for the entire group, and in particular perhaps the regulators, is that aren't we risking, depending on the type of framework and regulatory tools that we decide to apply then to AI, to deprive governments of very important functions, and the ordering functions inevitably given to governments to govern the society? And how can we think about a regulatory framework that bears in mind the risks, that also at the same time is effective in cooperating with the private sector, and making sure that the private sector is mindful of the problems that will emerge at large with the developments of AI. And here I conclude. I think I was quite precise with my time. And once again, my thanks to Julia for the kind invitation. I'm very keen to listen to all of your reaction and your thoughts on these very interesting presentations. And yes, a pleasure to be here and learning from you all.
Thank you, Julia. So before we give back the floor to the speakers to react on the comments by our discussants, I've seen that there are a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is for Helena Quinn. So the member of the audience is interested to hear more about the challenges for stakeholders to do effective audits in terms of access to the models and data, and what are the accepted grounds to refuse access. Is there a need for a sui generis right to audit perhaps, and what will such a specific right look like? Thank you.
I mean, that's a very good question. I think it really depends on who's doing the audit. So if it's a regulator doing the audit under their powers, then companies have to cooperate and comply. If it's, for example, we heard from lots of civil society actors across Europe and the US saying that they found it very difficult to access models and data from within a company. So that's why they were doing more of these empirical audits where they could just see what the outputs of the system were and assess their impact on different demographics. I think researchers sometimes have a bit more access, but it really depends on what the company allows. So some companies have in the past been quite good at giving access to researchers to test their systems. Some of them do, you have bug bounties where there's a general call out for people to find vulnerabilities. It could be cyber vulnerabilities, it could be other things in an algorithmic system. And they compete against each other to sort of really thoroughly test the system. I mean, in terms of accepted grounds to refuse access, there's not a huge amount that you can do unless you mandate audits. And under the proposals in the EU AI Act, there are actually it's voluntary ones as far as I think. But there will be, as far as I know, in the Online Safety Bill, which is another piece of legislation going through the UK Parliament at the moment, that sort of more audit requirements, and there are audit requirements under existing laws in the UK, including data protection, where we issue an assessment notice. So if we do that as regulators, we can get access to what we need. But it's difficult for others. And that's more of a culture of transparency and openness more than anything. So if we can encourage a lot more of that from private sector actors, make transparency mandatory. I mean, it is already an enforceable GDPR principle to provide transparency about how personal data is processed. If we can expand that, then that's always welcome.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat to Giulia Gentile about the harms that you were mentioning in your comments. So the point is how much the knowledge about the harms are shared about the decision amongst the decision makers, and whether what we don't know yet or the harms that are not identified yet are due to the lack of stakeholders representation and lack of diversity in the EI ecosystem.
Thanks for this question. I think that there's extensive research carried when it comes to the harms of AI, and therefore, in a way, I don't think this is an area where there isn't a consensus, in the sense that it's evident and well known the fact that AI has an intrinsic bias, because the data that is used to feed some algorithms, of course, is only historical data. We cannot know for the future, and this already creates in itself a limit for what certain machines can do. There is the risk of bias, and inevitably, of course, that of discrimination. And all these issues are very well reported and explored. So I think that the point that was raised in the question about stakeholder representation is absolutely on point. And this brings me back also to the remarks by Jack about the UK AI Summit, where we see that only some stakeholders will be represented. And this can tell us already a bit about what is the strategy there, what kind of voices will be heard. but inevitably this will be problematic for the society at large and NGOs and those who are the most vulnerable towards AI, which are not necessarily the big tech companies. So I think that representation would be very, very important and would be absolutely welcome. Better representation for all interests vis-a-vis AI.
Thank you, Julia. And by the way, thank you, Jack, for putting a link in the chat. For those who are interested, there are a series of events across London to complement UK Government AI Safety Summit to try to include more different voices in the discussion. So if you're interested, have a look at the link. One last round of very short comments. If some of the other speakers want to react, Kai, Giovanni, maybe you want to react to some of the comments by the discussant.
Yeah, I can maybe say also something on the question of Freya from the chat. So yes, the AI Act is, as I said, now becoming more and more principle-based, and this is now also connected to some other things that have been said. A little bit is it's based on the realization of the EU legislators that we are making a lot of digital laws that are very often addressing US big tech firms, but in the end, all those rules are often extremely difficult for European SMEs and startups to comply with, while the big companies are not easily able to do it, but much more easier in finding compliance, and which again leads to a situation what we saw with the GDPR, that the big data market was further cemented, that market dominant players became even more market dominant. With this principle-based approach and a few other additions that the European Union is currently doing, we are trying to go a little bit in a different direction. You saw the Digital Services Act and the Digital Market Act, which is one of those variants or options, which is really focusing on the big players, so digital gatekeepers in the Digital Market Act, and let really them face the most difficult or most intense obligations. The AI Act is, on the other hand, horizontal, so it's using a different option. In this option, in this principle-based option, a lot will happen via harmonized standards. So in the AI Act, Article 40 is saying that if you as a company are building your product built on a harmonized standard, then you are benefiting from a so-called presumption of conformity. So you are complying with the AI Act. On top, there should be regulatory sandboxes which help companies to go in a kind of dialogue with the government or with the national competent authorities in order to learn about the rules, how they should adapt it, and so on and so on. And another point is then that, of course, guidelines will be written that also, in the end, hopefully benefit smaller market players. So those are all now test balloons, let's call it like this, because again, the European Union realized that with our old approaches, especially in the digital field, we were not super successful, but it's way too early to say, okay, this is the best way to do it, or this is the best way to do it. What you can really see, and this was a little bit your question, it's a lot of small try and error actions now, but I would say most of them are really very, very heavily based on harmonized standards.
Thank you, Jack. Giovanni, I don't know if you want to have some final reactions or comments.
Go, Giovanni.
No, Jack, please, let's go in reverse order. I've been the first, so you will be the first now.
So I mean, it's been really, really interesting to hear everybody's concerns and to hear from people much closer to the regulatory coalface than me. I mean, my big concern, and I think it hasn't been resolved by hearing about UK and European initiatives, is that we are still basically, regardless of the technocracy of the whole thing, we are basically still leaving innovators to their own devices. We are letting innovators define what counts as risky, which is hugely risky. We are thinking about some forms of risk, and there may be other forms of risk, like risks to the intellectual property of creators, for example, that we haven't talked about very much, that might undermine the whole edifice. So I think there is a real danger of groupthink here. And I think the more of these sorts of conversations we can have to destabilize those discussions as we keep building regulations, the better. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I know that we have not so much time. The only thing I wanted to say is that it's interesting to see how there are, different, forms of reactions, I mean, to the same issues at the end, and then plus these issues are also quite transnational, as you know very well. So, I mean, we are still trying to fight with different, tools to address the same problem, like it happens in so many other areas of policy and law, like migration, the environment, and so forth. I mean, we really need to think about that. I mean, I'm not advocating for having a global law, whatever, international agreement on AI. I'm just saying that we really need to think more about the connections among all our legal systems, particularly the UK and the EU, especially in this political moment as well. Also to have a different type of conversation, also with the US or other countries, because at the end, if the law has also a role in this debate. I mean, it's also important that we talk the same language up to a certain point in terms of the legal systems. Otherwise, we still try to advocate that our system is better than another, while the AI, system and that kind of also the market will thrive and will go ages, further, and we will stay still discussing what is transparency. Yes.
Perfect. Thank you all so much for your comments, for your reactions. Kate, Liam, do we want to add something? No? Perfect. So thank you all so much for being here today. This has been very interesting discussion. I learned a lot. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy agenda for discussing with us today. And please have a look to our social media accounts for the TIP group for upcoming events. We have a lot of other things going on. So thank you for coming. And there were also some reading suggestions in the chat, a special issue on EI and power in particular, if you're interested in that. So thank you again and have a good afternoon. Thank you.